Thanks. Well, thanks for the introduction. And yep, I'll be presenting part of my final PhD chapter, which is still a work in progress, so I don't have any results to show yet. But first, I would like to begin by acknowledging the traditional owners of the lands on which we are all gathered today, and I pay my respects to the elders past, present, and emerging. So as I imagine we already know, ecosystems provide important habitat for wildlife, being critical for ensuring species survival and long-term persistence. They also provide important contributions to people in the form of ecosystem services like food and raw materials. However, human-induced threats such as land use change, pollution, invasive species, and climate change, among others, impact biodiversity worldwide, which increases the risk of species extinction and undermines the resilience of ecosystems. Currently, Australia has over 1,800 species and 83 ecosystems listed as threatened under national conservation law. And unfortunately, there are many ecosystems globally categorized as threatened under the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems, which is a written method and a global standard for assessing risk of ecosystem collapse and setting threat categories like the ones shown here. So for a bit of context, this diagram here shows the criteria that is used to assess collapse risk, where an ecosystem can be threatened due to a reduction in size or geographic extent, and or by having an inherently restricted yet threatened distribution, and or by abiotic degradation and alteration of biotic processes and interactions, such as overgrazing or invasive species. Therefore, recovery of ecosystems can occur when a degraded ecosystem has regained its composition, structure, and function relative to a reference state through restoration activities like revegetation or pest control. So focusing efforts on ecosystem recovery is an important task if we aim to protect biodiversity as a whole, and if we also want to achieve the objectives of Australia's threatened species strategy and international commitments. Therefore, my project aims to answer what is required to recover threatened ecosystems to potentially delist them. And if this is not possible, what would be appropriate targets to set for ecosystem recovery? So by using the IUCN Red List of Ecosystems criteria, my project aims to first evaluate the ecological and technical feasibility of recovering threatened Australian ecosystems. Second, develop a prioritization framework to identify cost-effective areas to recover extent. And finally, to develop broadly applicable guidelines to determine how to recover ecosystems. So I will work using 2 case studies to develop and test this framework. One is the critically endangered Cumberland Plain woodlands, and the other is the endangered alpine sphagnum box and associated ferns. So first, to assess the recovery potential of ecosystem integrity, I will elicit expert knowledge through workshops for each case study with the support of conceptual models, such as this example, which are really useful because they help to visually represent ecosystem change and identify recovery pathways. So for example, for the Cumberland Plain woodland case study, African olive invasion has been recognized as a key threatening process and was considered as the biotic degradation process under criterion D. So in this case, we will ask experts to score the likelihood of transitioning to a recovered state and the different management strategies that would potentially reduce the severity and the extent of African olive invasion. Then my project will also focus on recovery of lost ecosystem area by potentially restoring its original extent. So going back to the same case study, the Cumberland Plain woodland has unfortunately lost already more than 90% of its original distribution. So to downgrade its threat status from critically endangered to an endangered status, it would be needed to be restored by at least 6,000 hectares or 5% of its original or pre-clearing distribution. So the idea here is that I will determine where this restoration can occur most cost effectively to minimize costs and maximize success by accounting for factors such as management costs, land uses, and land tenures. So finally, the idea is that by doing these two phases, I will then generalize these findings into a broadly applicable framework and guidelines for other ecosystems, summarizing common issues and recommending solutions. So we are now in the UN Decade for Ecosystem Restoration, and the international biodiversity targets for 2050 are being negotiated by the CBD. So now is the perfect opportunity to look at how we can shift these declining trends towards a positive trajectory of recovery, and my project is one step towards that goal. So I would like to thank you all for listening, and also thank you to the Australian Wildlife Society for supporting my project.